Hi guys, I hope you're all doing really well. My name is Sarah, welcome back to What the Horror, the channel where we talk about horror movies old and new. Also, welcome to a new episode of Truly Horror, the series where we talk about the true stories, the true events, and the true crimes surrounding certain horror movies. The behind-the-scenes stuff that is often stranger and scarier than the movies themselves. Today we're talking about the true story behind The Conjuring 3, The Devil Made Me Do It, the third Conjuring movie, the eighth movie in the Conjuring universe, and the fourth movie that involves the Warrens. Arne Johnson stabs and murders his landlord, but claims he was under demonic possession at the time. Ed and Lorraine Warren decide to investigate the case and try to prove his innocence. The Conjuring 3 was released in 2021, 5 years after The Conjuring 2. This time James Wan did not return to direct due to scheduling conflicts, but did remain as a producer. Instead, it was directed by Michael Chaves, who had previously done another installment in the Conjuring universe, The Curse of La Llorona. On July 18, 1981, Ed and Lorraine Warren were called to document the exorcism of 8-year-old David Glatzel, or so the opening card of the movie tells us. The Glatzel family and the Warrens are awaiting the arrival of Father Gordon, who is coming to bless the house. The Glatzel family consists of David's mother, father, older sister Debbie, and Debbie's fiancé, 19-year-old Arne Johnson. We see very quickly in the opening of the movie that Arne has a very good relationship and is very close with the family, especially David. By the time Father Gordon arrives, David's condition has worsened, and Ed Warren makes the call that they need to perform the exorcism right now instead of taking him to a church. During the exorcism, David roars, foams at the mouth, and contorts in these really disturbing ways. He also levitates off of the table, and furniture flies around the room, some of it knocking Father Gordon unconscious. Ed is then forced to take over performing the exorcism, but as he does, he is attacked by the possessed David. During this, Arne, to protect Ed and mostly David, addresses the demon and tells it to leave David alone and take him instead. Against Ed's warnings to stop, Arne continues shouting at the demon, and we see that it does leave David and enters Arne instead. Ed has a heart attack after being attacked by the possessed David and ends up unconscious in the hospital for weeks. But when he eventually wakes up, he tells Lorraine that it's not over, but that the demon has now possessed Arne. Lorraine calls the local police to warn them that she believes there will be a tragedy at the residence of Arne and Debbie. During this, we see that Arne and Debbie are now living in an apartment above the kennels that Debbie works in, and that her boss and their landlord is one in the same, a Bruno Sauls. Arne has begun to have bad dreams and visions of a woman dressed in black and wakes up with night terrors. Due to lack of sleep and feeling unfocused and ill at work one day, Arne returns home to the kennels. He wants to rest but is instead grabbed by a drunk Bruno who forcefully persuades Arne to fix his stereo for him. While he's working on the stereo, Arne becomes more feverish and hallucinates Bruno grabbing Debbie really aggressively. At first, Arne tries to leave with Debbie, who is becoming confused by his actions, but he trips and he falls on the floor, hallucinating Bruno changing form and running at them, so he stabs Bruno 22 times. Not long after, a patrol car is on its way to the kennels and passes a dazed-looking, possessed Arne, covered in blood, walking along the side of the road. Arne is arrested, and at some unspecified point, the Warrens become involved in the case again. We can assume that it's probably quite quickly seen as how they were involved in David's possession. Lorraine and Ed visit Arne in prison, trying to determine if he is possessed, but the fact that Lorraine senses nothing and that Arne can recite passages of the Bible leads Ed to believe that Arne is not possessed, but he does say that that doesn't mean he never was. Debbie tells the Warrens that she was there, and whatever did happen that day, it wasn't Arne that did it. Ed and Lorraine agree to help Arne and speak with his lawyer. She tells the Warrens that things don't look good for Arne as he was found covered in blood and that the murder weapon belonged to him and had his fingerprints on it. She says that she doesn't think that Arne deserves the death penalty, but she is against the idea of claiming demonic possession like the Warrens are suggesting. Despite Lorraine offering to help prove the claim, Arne's lawyer retorts that it's never been done successfully, and that while they may have proven demonic existence to the church, a court has very different standards of evidence. However, after an invite to tea round at the Warrens and a tour of their evidence and an introduction to Annabelle, we smash cut to Danbury Superior Court, September September 19th, 1981, with the previously smug lawyer now looking like she's seen a ghost and wearing a crucifix. And when the judge asks how they plead to the charge of first-degree murder, the lawyer responds, "Not guilty, by reason of demonic possession." After the hearing, Arne's lawyer tells the Warrens that the prosecution is going after the death penalty, and that Arne's life now depends on the evidence that they find. Ed and Lorraine decide to go back over details of the case. The events had begun in April 1981, with Ed and Lorraine becoming involved in July the same year. The trouble began for the Glatzel family on the day that they moved into their new house. While the whole family claimed to experience strange things, it was only David who actually saw anything. Ed and Lorraine wondered if David had accidentally invited the demon in on the first day when he was attacked by it on a waterbed that had been left by the previous owners. Returning to the Glatzel house, the Warrens notice some damage to the floor where the waterbed stood. Debbie discards it as water damage, but Lorraine says it's a sign of something more sinister, and she goes into the crawl space under the house, especially under the room, to investigate where she finds a witch's totem. Later at their house, Ed and Lorraine explain to Debbie that witches' totems are used by Satanists in rituals, that they no longer believe that David invited the inhuman spirit into the house, but that he was actually cursed. Now believing that the demon was drawn out by the witch's totem by someone, they decide to post photos of the witch's totem to multiple police forces in the hopes that one of them has seen one in other cases. At the suggestion of Father Gordon, the Warrens also pay a visit to a retired priest, a Father Kastner, who had previously worked with the disciples of the Ram cult, believing that he may be able to help them. Back in the prison, we see that Arne is being haunted by and attacked by the demonic spirit, and because he becomes visibly distressed, the prison staff sedate him. Debbie and David visit Arne and see the toll that the demonic presence is taking on him. Concerned for his safety, the Warrens advise Debbie to tell the prison chaplain that Arne should be put in isolation and given 24-hour surveillance. The Warrens' investigation takes them to Danvers, Massachusetts, after the police there recognised the witch's totem in the photo. This leads them to working with the Denver police on a murder/missing persons case. A girl named Katie Lincoln was stabbed 22 times by her friend Jessica, who then went missing herself. The police had found a witch's totem at the scene, which leads the Warrens to believe that Jessica was cursed by the same person David and Arne were. Thanks to Lorraine's abilities, they discovered that after Jessica stabbed Katie, she jumped off a cliff to her death, and the police finally recover her body. When the Warrens return home, their colleague Drew has found information on the curse in an old text from the Renaissance. It tells them that to break the curse, they need to destroy the altar that it was cast from. While home, Ed becomes affected by the curse himself and tries to attack Lorraine. They discover that a witch's totem has been brought into the house in a bunch of flowers that was delivered. While on 24-hour surveillance in the prison chaplain gives Arne a glass bottle of holy water for him to be able to protect himself, but the Satanist reaches out to Arne again and makes him crush the bottle and use broken shards of the glass to injure himself. Lorraine decides to visit Kastner again to see if he can translate more information from the book that Drew found. He does, and he says that the curse needs 3 victims to be completed: the child, the lover, and the man of God. And Lorraine realises that Ed is the 3rd victim, and that David was originally the intended victim, and Arne now being possessed is just simply because of Arne inviting the demon in. It's revealed that Kastner had a daughter and that she is the one causing the curse. Kastner, feeling guilty for his daughter, leads Lorraine to the altar, but is then killed by his daughter Isla. Isla then pursues and attacks Lorraine. At the same time, back at the prison ward, Arne is being affected by the curse again, and is contorting like David did and levitating off of his bed. The prison chaplain tries to subdue the demon by reciting from the Bible, but is unable to stop the possessed Arne from trying to kill himself. Luckily though, Ed has figured out where the altar is located. He heads off and arrives just in the nick of time to both rescue Lorraine and destroy the altar, saving Arne in the process. The movie ends with the conclusion of the court case where it tells us that on November 24th, 1981, Arne Johnson was convicted of manslaughter and served 5 years, marrying Debbie while in prison. The true story of Arne Johnson began in July 1980, when 11-year-old David Glatzel helped Arne Johnson, the 19-year-old fiancé of his older sister Debbie, clean a rental property he was planning to move into. While there, David claimed he saw a burnt-looking old man who then pushed him onto a waterbed and told David he would harm all of them if they moved in. David continued to see this old man even after leaving the rental property and returning back home. He'd wake up in the night screaming, covered in bruises and scratches. David described the man as having sunken features and charred skin as if it had been burnt. He said the old man wore jeans and a flannel shirt and had white beard and often had animal-like features of hooves, horns, pointed ears and jagged teeth. Allegedly, the whole family heard strange noises coming from the attic, but no one except David witnessed the old man. The Glatzel family consisted of David's mother and father, Judy and Carl, Debbie, David's older sister, Carl Jr., David's brother, and 11-year-old David himself. Debbie's fiancé Arne was very close to the family, and at one point Debbie asked Arne to stay at the Glatzels' home while the alleged possession was happening. The Glatzel family became worried about David's change in behaviour. He had, according to his older sister Debbie, begun to kick, spit and swear at his family. He also suffered spasms and convulsions, which led to a member of the family staying up with him through the night to make sure that he wasn't hurt. The bruises and scratches continued to appear on his body, and his mother and sister Debbie both claimed to have seen David being choked by invisible hands, which then left red marks around his neck afterwards. So the family reached out to the Catholic Church for help, and they were eventually visited by a Catholic priest who attempted to bless the house. When this didn't seem to help or change anything, the family then reached out to the Warrens, who at this point in 1980 were already well known for the work that they did. Ed Warren claimed he heard banging and growling sounds coming from the basement of the house, and that he saw one of David's toys, a dinosaur, move on its own. He also told the Washington Post, "Right away, I knew there was something to this. I felt like a good fisherman when he knows there's something on the line." Lorraine Warren claimed that when her husband Ed interviewed David, she saw a black mist appear next to David. In an interview, she said, "While Ed interviewed the boy, I saw a black misty form next to him, which told me we were dealing with something of a negative nature. Soon the child was complaining that invisible hands were choking him and there were red marks on him. He said that he had the feeling of being hit." Lorraine also claimed that David began to hiss, growl and speak in unrecognisable voices and perfectly recite passages from Paradise Lost and the Bible. Which, side note, I find interesting because in the film, the fact that Arne could read from the Bible was proof to the Warrens that he was not possessed. Ed also believed that there were actually 43 demons inside David and not just one, and due to this prognosis, 3 lesser exorcisms were performed on David by the Warrens and local priests, but none of them were successful because the demon would always push David to the brink of death and make him beg for his mother to spare his life. After the continued efforts of the Warrens and several priests failed, permission was given for a formal exorcism to be performed on David. Lorraine claimed that during the exorcism, David levitated and even stopped breathing for a while. The following is a description of the exorcism from Gerald Brittle's book about the case, The Devil in Connecticut. It appeared as though David had actually experienced a heart attack. The pulse and heartbeat were nil. The boy's skin grew white, his body lay motionless, seemingly depleted of life. By the time a full minute had passed, those in the room could not help but take it for real. Desperate to save David's life, Arne declared, "Let David live. Take me on. Come into me." According to The Devil in Connecticut, Ed Warren wasn't actually present at the exorcism and so didn't witness Arne's outburst. He was apparently at home in his study at the exact same time of the exorcism, performing a ritual to summon the demon with the hope of binding it. Ed apparently experienced a visit from the demon who was possessing David, and it showed him many demonic faces, leaving Ed to realise that it wasn't multiple demons possessing David like he had originally believed, but rather one demon with multiple faces. Ed said, "As a whole, the entity was overwhelming. It could not be dealt with. Binding was impossible. If I had started, it would have killed me." Witnesses of the exorcism claimed they saw the demon flee David, but while it left David, that doesn't mean it was defeated, as it had only moved into Arne instead. With time, David seemed to improve while Arne began to deteriorate. Arne Johnson and Debbie moved out of the Glatzel house after David began to improve. They decided against the original rental property and instead rented an apartment close to where Debbie worked as a dog groomer in a dog kennel in Brookfield, Connecticut. The man they rented the apartment from was also Debbie's boss at the kennel, an Alan Bono. After the couple had moved into the apartment, Arne's behaviour began to change and he exhibited similar behaviour to David. Debbie claimed that Arne would growl and hallucinate seeing the beast, and that he'd go into a trance-like state and have no memory of it afterwards. Arne claimed that at one point the demon took control of his car and forced him to drive into a tree, but luckily Arne wasn't harmed from the accident. I did see another claim that Arne, after the car incident, returned to the rental property where it all began and encountered the demon within an old well found on the property. Arne claimed that this was his last lucid encounter with the demon, as he was possessed when he looked into the demon's eyes. Now, I was only able to find this claim in one source, so it's not the most reliable event. On February 16th, 1981, Arne returned home from his job at Right Tree Service feeling sick. He went to see Debbie at the kennel, where there was also Alan Bono, Arne's sisters Wanda, who was 15, and Janice, who was 13, and Debbie's 9-year-old cousin Mary. Alan Bono took the group out for lunch at a local bar where he also drank quite a lot, and after they finished lunch, they all returned to the kennel again. A little later, Debbie took the younger girls out to get a pizza, but wanted to return quickly as she was worried that something bad would happen. When she returned, Alan, being very drunk at this point, became agitated, and worrying that an argument would start, Debbie told the girls to leave the room, but Alan grabbed hold of Mary and wouldn't let go. Arne approached Alan and told him to let the girl go. Mary was able to break free and apparently ran to the car. Debbie was trying to calm the situation by standing in between the two men who were sort of facing off against each other, and Wanda was trying to pull Arne away from Alan. But Arne began to growl like an animal and pulled out a 5-inch pocket knife and stabbed Alan multiple times, however not the 22 times referenced in the movie. He had significant injuries to his chest and stomach. There was another account that the actual reason Arne had gone to the kennel in the first place wasn't just to see Debbie, but to fix a stereo for Alan, who lived above the kennel. In this account, Alan had again been drinking. I'm assuming the group still went out for lunch, and that's where Alan had been drinking, but the argument, instead of being over Mary, was actually over the stereo. Unlike in the movie, Alan Bono didn't die immediately, but instead died several hours later in hospital. Arne was later found and arrested 2 miles from the scene of the crime and was taken to the Bridgeport Correctional Center with bail set at $125,000. The details of what happened between the attack and Arne being arrested aren't clear, as Arne apparently was in a catatonic state, and when the police found him, he just had no memory whatsoever of the murder. Arne Johnson's trial began on October 28, 1981 at Connecticut Superior Court in Danbury. Arne's lawyer, Martin Manella, entered a plea of not guilty due to demonic possession. It was the first known court case in America that had attempted to do this. This plea was immediately thrown out by the judge, Robert Callahan, who said it was irrelative and unscientific to allow testimony on these grounds due to the lack of evidence. And so the jury was not legally allowed to take demonic possession into consideration. Despite this ruling by the judge, a media storm had been whipped up due to the Warrens informing the Brookfield police that Arne had been possessed when he committed the crime. The media frenzy was further fueled by the Warrens promising lectures, a book, and a movie detailing the case and the crime. During the case, it was reported that Debbie and Arne had been on friendly terms with Alan Bono in the 3 months that they'd lived nearby. But there were other reports that perhaps Debbie and Alan had been more than friends, and that the argument between Arne and Alan was over Debbie and not Mary or Asterio. But Debbie denied this. It took the jury 15 hours, over 3 days, to come to a verdict, but on November 24th, 1981, Arne Johnson was convicted of first-degree manslaughter and sentenced to 10 to 20 years. Arne would only end up serving 5 of those years, being released in 1986. While in prison, Arne married Debbie and got his high school diploma. When he was released, the couple went on to have 2 children. Not much is known about what happened to Arne and Debbie after, except that they both corroborate the Warrens' version of events, and they actually helped on the movie. According to Lorraine Warren, Arne now works as a landscaper, and Debbie sadly passed away after the movie was released after battling with cancer. There seems to be some dispute between the Glatzel family themselves as to what actually happened to both Arne and David. Arne and Debbie, like I said, always maintained that Arne had been possessed by the same demon who possessed David. Judy Glatzel, David's mother, also believed that her son had been possessed, but his father did not. David's father believed that David had actually been mentally ill and that he simply got better over time. It's also said that he wondered if his wife had been caught up in the satanic panic that was happening at the time. A member of the Glatzel family who isn't really included in the movie is David's brother Carl. Carl apparently never believed David was possessed, and like his father, just believed that David was instead mentally ill. Even David, as an adult, refutes the possession story. In 1983, Lorraine Warren released the book The Devil in Connecticut, which she wrote with Gerald Brittle. Carl Glatzel claims that the Warrens told the family they would share the profits with them and make them millionaires. But in reality, the family were only ever paid $2,000. When the book was republished in 2006, Carl and David actually sued the authors and publishers for violating their privacy and, quote, intentional infliction of emotional distress, end quote. In The Conjuring 3, during David's exorcism in the opening scene, Ed is attacked by the possessed David, who tries to stop his heart. This leads to Ed having a heart attack and remaining unconscious in the hospital for weeks. Ed eventually wakes up but is confined to a wheelchair for a while before he's able to walk again, but with the aid of a walking stick. It seems to be, from what I read online, the inclusion of Ed's ailments was just to move the movie's plot towards Lorraine's real-life work with the police as a psychic. In real life, while Ed Warren did suffer multiple heart attacks during the 1980s, including a debilitating one that meant that he was in a wheelchair for months, he didn't actually have one during the exorcism of David or at any point during the case. As I mentioned, in The Conjuring 3, Lorraine aids the police in Danvers by using her psychic abilities to locate the missing Jessica. The Warrens go to Danvers, Massachusetts after the police there recognise the witch's totem. This leads them to helping the police with a missing person case, where Katie Lincoln was stabbed 22 times by her friend Jessica, who then ran away from the scene. With Lorraine's help, it's later discovered she jumped off a cliff to her death. A witch's totem was found at the scene of the murder, and they discovered that Jessica was also possessed, just like Arne, cursed by the same person. Just a side note that Lorraine also claims to have met Elvis, both before and after he died. We also have more Elvis in the soundtrack, like we did in The Conjuring 2, and honestly, in my opinion, more horror movies should include his music. In real life, Lorraine Warren did help on multiple missing person cases and a variety of other cases during the 80s. In 1989, the Department of Justice actually issued a handbook on how to work with clairvoyants and psychics. The story of Jessica and Katie is a side plot to the movie's main plot of Arne Johnson. In the film, these events are brought about by the same person who cursed Arne, the Satanist Isla. In real life, there was no Katie and Jessica. This part of the plot was created for the movie to help flesh it out and move the narrative along. The Conjuring 3's antagonist is a woman called Isla, who was born to Father Kastner, who violated the requirement of clerical celibacy in the Catholic Church. Kastner has since retired, but while he was still a priest, he had previously dealt with the disciples of the Ram cult, wanting to understand why they did what they did. Over the years, he researched the occult and collected various texts and items pertaining to the occult. Isla, as she grew older, became fascinated by the occult through being exposed to so much of it and eventually becoming an occultist herself. Isla casts a curse, offering a demon a soul through human sacrifice. To complete the curse, 3 victims are needed: the child, the lover, and the man of God. Unfortunately for Isla, Ed and Lorraine break the curse when Ed smashes the altar, and she is then killed by the demon as a payment of a soul. Like the inclusion of Katie and Jessica, Father Kastner and his occultist daughter Isla are just a work of fiction made up for the movie's plot. However, the decision to make the movie's antagonist a satanic occultist was a very purposeful one that was to tap into the very real fear that was sweeping across America during the 1980s, satanic panic. According to online definitions, satanic panic is a moral panic consisting of over 12,000 unsubstantiated cases of satanic ritual abuse starting in America in the 1980s. Spreading throughout many parts of the world by the late 1990s, and which shocked me to my core, is still persisting today. The origin of the panic is credited to the publication of Michelle Remembers in 1980. Written by Canadian psychiatrist Lawrence Pasder and his patient and future wife Michelle Smith. The book has since been discredited, but was a type of autobiography in which Pasder had used the discredited practice of recovery memory therapy and made claims about satanic ritual abuse involving Michelle Smith. It was also the first modern claim that abuse against children was linked to satanic rituals. The problem is, the book was released at a time where the idea of the nuclear family was still expected, but more and more women were leaving the house to work, both by choice and by necessity, because they were in a recession. So many families were relying on daycare for their children, and a feeling of guilt and worry came with doing that. It was also a time where people were beginning to confront the problem of SA and becoming aware that it included children as victims as well. So when Michelle Remembers was published, it tapped into a nation's fear, created panic, and just escalated at an alarming rate. There was no evidence to back up any of these fears. In fact, of the 12,000 and more cases of accusations made nationwide, the investigating police were never able to substantiate any of the allegations. However, that didn't stop people actually going to prison or millions of dollars being spent on prosecutions. There were reports of physical abuse and SA against children for rituals, and allegations of children being abducted for a whole bunch of things that would get me demonetized if I talked about them. Apparently, there were nearly 200 people charged, with lots of them actually being convicted during the panic. Many were later released from prison, but only years later. News reports fanned the flames of fear. Parents were digging under preschool daycare centres looking for secret tunnels, and many things were being accused of being satanic, including the board game Dungeons and Dragons. During the 1980s, the board game was believed to be dangerous and corrupting the minds of the children who played it. It was believed that the game promoted witchcraft, violence, and Satanism. This very real fear was actually tapped into and addressed in the most recent series of Stranger Things involving the Hellfire Club, and this is the same fear that The Conjuring 3 taps into with its antagonist. So that's it, guys, the true story behind The Conjuring 3, The Devil Made Me Do It. Like I've said with this series, the true story is up for interpretation based on your own beliefs, but I think this is the one that appears to have the fewest people who were actually involved in the events who believed or still believe that it was a demonic possession, unlike the Perrons and the Hodgsons who always maintained their stories. That's it for The Conjuring Truly Horrors for now, but seeing as how we've just had the announcement that The Conjuring 4 has got the go-ahead, very exciting. I'm sure I'll be covering that when it comes out, if it's based on a true story. But if you're a fan of the Conjuring universe and have been enjoying the latest Truly Horrors, then don't worry, because next I'll be tackling the true story behind Annabelle, and eventually the true story behind the Amityville Hauntings, another case of the Warrens. Don't forget to let me know your thoughts on this film and the case in the comments down below. I find researching these episodes so interesting, and I love to hear your take on them, both the film and the real version. Also, don't forget to subscribe, like, share, all that jazz. But in the meantime, thank you as always for stopping by. I really do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you in the next episode. Bye, guys.